And Ben's effectiveness, I think, just as a killer in general, comes from how unpredictable he is, how unpredictable he operates. You know, the film stages like several really cool moments where characters think that we've outsmarted this monkey, only to be cornered, by him, only for Ben to use the environment in a way that feels, plausible, like in a really disturbing way. And, he climbs, he ambushes people, he retreats or returns multiple times when it obviously benefits him. And there's just this chilling sense that, like, Ben is learning as the film goes on, adapting to human behavior and exploiting hesitation or some of these characters, like overconfidence, if you will. So for those that don't know, I love a good creature feature. There's just something so entertaining about a killer animal movie that just pits man against nature. It's just always been so thrilling to watch, whether it be in like all-time classics like Steven Spielberg's Jaws, or underappreciated movies like The Edge featuring Anthony Hopkins and Alec Baldwin, to even more like recent stuff like that killer alligator movie from a couple years ago, Crawl. That was a really fun film. And of course, we've also gotten a number of great killer monkey movies over the years. Stuff like Monkey Shines, George Romero's, Monkey Shines, which, George Romero probably best known for his Living Dead trilogy, Night and Dawn and Day. But he did other movies other than zombie films. Monkey Shines is one of those other movies, and I always thought that movie was great. We also gotten stuff like Congo, which of course was a book written by Michael Crichton, obviously adapted in the mid-90s, kind of chasing the coattails, if you will, of Jurassic Park, and dealt with, killer, albino apes, and that was pretty fun. I have a love for that movie. And, recently, I just saw 1983's Link the other day, which is about this pyromaniac orangutan. And that was pretty fun. I really enjoyed that. Elizabeth Shue and Terrence Stamp. And, of course, you've always had the King Kong movies for years, ever since the original King Kong film came out, 1933. And we've gotten so many different adaptations and variations on that iconic, ape, that iconic monkey character that's been running amok for decades. Going on a century now, nearly a century now at this point. So, like when I first saw the trailer for Primate, a more recent killer monkey movie, it looked like it could be very entertaining. And a great way, I think, to just kick off 2026 in January. I know. January is not a great month for movies. There have been exceptions, obviously, a couple years ago, especially in terms of horror. Even though Megan 2.0 was disappointing, a couple years ago we had the first Megan, and that was like such a huge surprise and such a fun film. And so I'm thinking like, okay, well maybe Primate will be the Megan of 2026. Maybe we'll start off this new year right. And again, like I said, I really liked the trailer. I thought it was like super fun. But then I, like many people, I started looking into the movie and I realized like, oh, it's directed by Johannes Roberts. I believe that's that man's name. You probably aren't familiar with his name, but he's probably best known for directing, I think, like the 47 Meters Down killer shark movies. It's like, okay, he has some experience with those with killer animal movies, sure. But his last film was Resident Evil: Welcome to Raccoon City, back in 2021, which I think that is the worst Resident Evil movie, which is saying something because we haven't gotten any good Resident Evil theatrical released films ever. And I thought that was the worst one. And that was, of course, the most recent one. So going into this, I was a little concerned. I have to admit. But at the same time, despite having made that awful movie, I still like the trailer. And maybe good old Johannes, maybe he hit a stride as a filmmaker, with a killer monkey movie. Stranger things have happened. But for those that don't know, like, what is Primate about? What is the general synopsis? Well, essentially it follows these two sisters. One who's returning home to Hawaii with some friends to enjoy, a vacation, a tropical vacation, essentially. And also to reconnect with her dad as well. Basically, reconnect with her family. And the family has adopted and has raised this chimpanzee named Ben. And they've been raising him for many, many years, for research purposes, sign language, things like that. Well, at one point in the movie, he's bitten by a rabid mongoose, of all things, and suddenly he becomes very, very violent and begins murdering people in horrific, bloody fashion. Now, I'm going to be honest at the top. Primate surprised me in the best way possible. What could have easily been an awful and disposable January release, an awful and disposable creature feature, instead feels carefully directed, confident in its pacing most of the time, and also fun and just grisly to watch. Having people trying to survive against a murderous chimp it's just harrowing cinema. It's fun cinema, and also very suspenseful. And it's also just written with a lot of tension. And the tension, in my opinion, is one of Primate's greatest strengths. From the earliest sequences, there's an undercurrent of unease that just never fully lets go. You're constantly on edge watching this movie. And instead of telegraphing so many scares, the movie instead leans into anticipation. Using distant sounds, half-seen movements in the background, a lot of lingering shots that kind of dare you to keep looking deeper into the frame, deeper in the background if what you saw is what you indeed saw. A lot of stuff like that. There's just I guess I would describe it as this really strong spatial awareness, throughout the movie with the environments. They're all just used intelligently. With Ben the chimpanzee just to build suspense rather than just relying on, constant noise or frantic cutting. The editing is pretty good in this movie. The camera is steady, which is what I appreciate. The film knows when to also hold back at the same time, build up that tension, build up the suspense, and that patience, our patience eventually pays off. At least that's how I felt watching the movie. And when things do finally escalate in the film, the payoff feels very earned and it's very nasty. It's very nasty and very goopy. And the film understands that. I think fear works best when our imagination is given room to participate within the movie itself, within the view experience. The special effects, particularly, they're done very, very well. With the character of Ben. They're genuinely impressive. The creature effects kind of strike a smart balance between several things, between practical animatronics, a man in a suit, and also some digital enhancements, a little bit of CGI. And it just gives Ben just a real physical presence that sells every moment he's on screen. They do a great job of using shadow with him. Most of this movie takes place in the dark and in the evening, at night, and that masks maybe some of the stuff that wouldn't maybe necessarily work in bright daylight, where it's it's a guy in a monkey suit. But here I think it works good. His movements also feel very animalistic and really unpredictable, since he has rabies after all, and the facial work conveys just enough intelligence, I think, just to make him unsettling without tipping into overly cartoonish territory, which it could have easily done so. It's clear that a lot of craft, a lot of care went into making Ben feel like a living threat rather than just a visual gimmick. And honestly, what makes Ben so unsettling is that the film just leans into his primate behavior throughout the movie, showcasing his strength, his speed, his problem solving, his intelligence, his sudden move shifts. Rather than exaggerating him into something supernatural, for instance. He's not a magic monkey, he's a chimpanzee. But that in itself is very terrifying. He reacts, he's calculating, he explodes into violence with just terrifying efficiency. And the movie consistently reminds you that this is an animal that doesn't need claws or even fangs to be lethal. He certainly has those things, but it's his intelligence. That's his weapon. And that's what makes him so intimidating and scary throughout the entire movie. And Ben's effectiveness, I think, just as a killer in general, comes from how unpredictable he is, how unpredictable he operates. The film stages several really cool moments where characters think that we've outsmarted this monkey, only to be cornered, by him, only for Ben to use the environment in a way that feels, plausible, in a really disturbing way. And, he climbs, he ambushes people, he retreats or returns multiple times when it obviously benefits him. And there's just this chilling sense that, Ben is learning as the film goes on, adapting to human behavior and exploiting hesitation or some of these characters overconfidence, if you will. And just combined with just excellent creature work and a physical performance, Ben becomes one of the more memorable just killer animals in recent genre cinema. Certainly in the last few years, at least for me. And I gotta tell you this, like the kills, which I'm not gonna spoil, but the kills are another standout element. They're handled with a level of creativity and brutality that horror fans, such as myself, will appreciate. And I think if you guys are horror fans, you like some grisly, gory stuff, that this movie has it on full display. These kills, they're very visceral without like feeling like mindless. They're very deliberate. Each one is staged a little differently from the other, which I think is cool. And it's just often just used to reinforce the stakes or really the characters, the human characters' mistakes. There's just a satisfying variety as to how a lot of this violence unfolds throughout the entire movie. And the film isn't afraid to linger just long enough to make each moment hit hard and make you feel very queasy. I mean, you've heard the horror stories of what chimpanzees do to these people that have adopted them and raising them, like, in a typical home and not in nature in the wild. And it's, yeah, they show some stuff like that. Also, the film's composer, Adrian Johnston, I believe that's their name. His score is very good. It's very synthy. I'm a sucker for a synthy score, especially a synthy horror score, and it plays throughout the movie. I really liked it. Really added to the atmosphere and the stakes and Ben's menacing behavior throughout the entire film. I really liked that. I guess in terms of more the negatives of the movie, it's not even like a super negative thing, but the characters in Primate they're serviceable. They really linger in your mind, once the credits roll, honestly. Most of the ensemble, like they fit the familiar genre archetypes that you've seen before. You have the rational lead, you have the skeptic character, the overconfident, dude bro, right, authority figure, if you will, that thinks he can push a chimpanzee off a cliff. And while they're performed, well enough, they exist more to just move the plot forward than to really define it, if you will. That isn't necessarily a flaw, in a creature-driven thriller, especially one like this. But it does mean that the emotional investment comes from more so the moment that they're in, like the situation that they're in, than from the people themselves, if you will. Like you care, about whether they survive, right? Like within that moment, you don't want to see them get mauled by a chimp and have their face ripped off, but not so much who they are beyond that immediate danger throughout the entire movie. The clear exception though is Troy Kotsur, who you may be unfamiliar with his name. The actor, but he's probably best known for Coda. He played the father in Coda, and he won an Academy Award for that movie a number of years ago. A very good performance in a very good movie. And he plays the father in this film, who presence, I think, he gives the film a nice kind of unexpected emotional anchor. His deafness, which he is deaf in this movie as well, obviously. It isn't treated as a gimmick or as a vulnerability to be just exploited, cheaply by the filmmaking. Instead, the film uses it in really genuinely clever ways, intense ways. Again, this movie is very, very tense. I want to emphasize that. Scenes are staged from like his perspective at times, stripping away like sound entirely, emphasizing like visual cues in moments where other characters would rely on that noise, but he does not, and that makes them thrilling. And this creates some of the film's like most effective like suspense moments, particularly towards the end of the film, when danger is approaching silently from his perspective, or when the audience realizes something that they themselves cannot hear because we've been placed in his shoes, essentially, even though we know it's like, oh my God, turn around, the monkey. He brings a lot of warmth, I think, to the film, a lot of resolved, that quiet authority, right? And his performance, I think, does add that texture to the story in a way that the other characters just simply didn't. Again, they're not necessarily like awful performers. They're not. It's just they're just not given the material. They're doing the best that they can with what they have. It's serviceable. And I guess just a lot of those moments. It's especially with Kotsur. It's just really, really smart how they able to build up more of the film's tension. And he's easily the most human element in this movie, in an otherwise very creature-focused creature feature. But despite the serviceable, if uninspired characters, overall, I think Primate succeeds because it takes its premise seriously enough, and it still manages to make some fun moments, and I think it executes them with a lot of skill. You have some really strong direction from Johans. You have some great sustained tension throughout the entire movie, great creature effects, and memorable kills. And I think it just all comes together to elevate the film all above, Johans' other work, which that's a good thing because I haven't really been a big fan of his other works. Again, it also serves as just a reminder that monster movies, still work best when they focus on atmosphere and craftsmanship and controlled escalation, building that tension, keeping you on edge. And I think, for fans of, like myself, of creature-driven, horror thrillers, like Primate is a sharp, confident entry that starts 2026 off with like a bloody and grisly Bane. But I enjoy this movie despite maybe some issues and some flaws to the character work. But what about you guys? What do you think of Primate? Are you a fan of creature features? Did you like the movie? Were you more mixed on? Did you downright hate it? Like, I don't need any of this monkeys. I don't need any of this monkey business. No, thank you. Let me know, and I'll see you next time.